As we continue our journey with the patriarchs, we now turn our attention to one of the characters that receives less attention in the Abraham story. I'm talking about Hagar. When we read the stories of Hagar, she usually goes to the background. She doesn't have a starring role. However, today we'll meditate on these stories from Hagar's point of view as the main character. We know very little about Hagar's past. The Genesis accounts tell us that she was the personal slave of Abraham's wife, Sarah, and she most likely was part of the group of servants that the Pharaoh of Egypt gave Abraham when he wanted to marry Sarah. Hagar was very possibly a teenage girl. And Hagar's story begins when one day her mistress Sarai called her and said, "Go and take a bath, because my husband is going to sleep with you." As we already know, Sarai wasn't able to bear children, so she proposed to Abraham that he sleep with her slave. And I don't mean to be explicit or offensive, but in the text, in the Hebrew text, one of the euphemisms to talk about having sexual relationships is used. When Adam and Eve have sexual intercourse, the biblical euphemism used is to know. Adam knew Eve, and this expression denotes intimacy and closeness. On the other hand, when Abraham is said to have relations with the slave, the euphemism, which is, by the way, quite graphic, denotes the mere sexual act. This implies that for both Sarai and Abraham, the slave was only an instrument, a means to fulfill their desire of having children. Being Sarai's slave, her son would actually be, by law of uses and customs of the day, Sarai's son. In fact, although Sarai gives her slave to Abraham so that the slave would be his wife, she would not actually have the same status as Sarai. The Egyptian slave would remain just a slave. But if she gave Abraham a male child, the slave would be considered the wife with more status, and her son the eldest and main heir. And that was just what happened. Abraham slept with a slave and she became pregnant, and then she, knowing that she would now be considered the most important wife, mocks and despises her mistress Sarai. And let's not play innocent. That is a typical reaction when we manage to get something that we know other people want. And of course, Sarai gets upset and complains to Abraham, her husband. "All of this is your fault. I gave you my slave to have sex with you, and now that she's pregnant, she feels superior to me. May God do justice between you and me." Abraham and Sarai are about to fight, and she blames him, and she even wants God to come and resolve the conflict. But they did not consult with God to begin with, when they decided on the life and body of the slave. Anyway, Abraham washes his hands of this conflict. "She's your slave. It was your idea. Do whatever you want." How easy. And Sarah isn't like she knew any better. Being the mistress, she could have commanded the slave to respect her. Even more, if she wanted to, she could have kicked her out of the camp by telling her just to go. But instead of facing the problem, Sarai prefers to make life difficult for her slave until she gets desperate and runs away from Sarai. But that only happens in this story. The slave runs away from Sarai and goes into the desert, tired from running in the desert sun, with dust in her eyes and hot sand under her feet. She arrives at a water fountain, and there she's found by the angel of Yahweh. The first thing that the slave hears from the angel sounds so familiar and at the same time so strange. Hagar. It's her name. But until this moment, for Sarai and Abram, she had only been the slave. But now the angel of Yahweh calls her by her name, Hagar. He recognizes her identity, recognizes her personhood. Hagar is more than the circumstances that have surrounded her. She's a woman, a person, not just a slave. But at the same time, she remains Sarai's slave. And the angel just calls her that. because the angel reminds her that Hagar is not defined as a person according to her circumstances, but also that she has unfinished business. That is why the angel asks her, "Where do you come from and where are you going?" And if you've read the Bible carefully enough, you know that when God asks these kinds of questions, is to get people to confront their history and their brokenness, to confess their faults and their shortcomings. So Hagar confesses, "I am running from Sarai, my mistress." Then the angel of Yahweh answers, "Return to your mistress and submit to her." But why should her? If Hagar was only the slave and she'd also been abused and mistreated by Sarai and Abram, she now at least was free. However, she was alone in the desert and pregnant. What chance did she have of surviving there in the desert? Surely less chance than in the camp of their masters. But beyond that, this is a test for Hagar not to respond in the same way that she had been treated. For her to show that she could turn the other cheek, to use the language of Jesus. That she was not going to continue playing these games of power and prestige, of seeing who is more important between her and Sarai. And more importantly, this is a test that has a reward, a covenant of blessing from God for her. Return to your mistress and submit under her, and I will multiply your offspring. I will bless your son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has heard your affliction. That's the message from God. God is making a covenant with Hagar just as he had done with Abram previously, especially the part about the multiplication of offspring, which is a symbol of divine blessing. Then Hagar acknowledges that she has had a special encounter with God, and to seal that moment, Hagar calls Yahweh with the name El Roi, the God who sees me. Hagar has personally met God in her own faith journey. But her journey doesn't end there. Hagar returns to her mistress, and she gives birth to her son, and Abram named him Ishmael. After about 14 years or so, Sarah, the mistress, the wife of Abram, had conceived and gave birth to her own son, Isaac. According to custom, Isaac was weaned when he was 2 or 3 years old, and his parents, so happy to have such a long-desired son, throw a party, a real feast. And in the middle of the celebration, something interesting happens with the half-brothers. Ishmael is playing with little Isaac. And that's right, they're playing together like brothers without knowing anything about the conflicts or the problems that their mothers have had. In many translations of the Bible, we read that Ishmael mocked Isaac. He was making fun of him. But there are several commentators who pose that the Hebrew verb can also be translated as play. Ishmael was playing with Isaac. The truth is that the text is ambiguous in that sense, and I think that's on purpose. As way of example, let's think about the verb to laugh. To laugh with someone is not the same as to laugh at someone. The first denotes play, camaraderie, complicity. The second, mockery and humiliation. And this verse and the verb works in the same way. And I think that this ambiguity is intentional because it reflects the internal conflict that Sarah has regarding Hagar and Ishmael. She sees the son of the Egyptian slave laughing and playing with Isaac as brothers, as if they were of equal status. Her son Isaac with that brat, the slave's son. It just can't be. Now, all that remains is for the slave son to share the inheritance with Isaac. Or even worse, that he receives more because he is the actual firstborn. And you know what, Abram? Right now you're kicking that slave and her son out of my house. Quickly now. And Abram got upset. How am I going to kick Ishmael out if he's my son? He's my heir. And God then speaks to Abraham to tell him not to feel bad about throwing Hagar and Ishmael out of the camp. It is true that the descendants of Abraham will be through Isaac, but God will also take care of Hagar and Ishmael, and will make a great nation of him as well. Perhaps out of remorse for all that has happened, Abraham gives Hagar some food and water, and then she leaves with Ishmael, her son, again into the desert. And there she wanders aimlessly, without direction, with nowhere to go. She can't go back to Abraham's camp, and she's been away from Egypt, her original home, for so long that who knows if she'll ever make it back. She's lost. And on top of that, she runs out of food, and after a short time, Hagar drops the last drops of water into the dry mouth of her son. I don't know how much longer they could continue walking, or rather staggering on the burning sand under the harsh desert sun. The boy Ishmael is so weak, he looks like a baby in his mother's arms. And finally, Hagar just gives up. She can't take it anymore. She finds a bush under which he lays Ishmael, who falls like a torn rag doll. Hagar moves away from her son for the first time, about 100 meters, because she has given up. She has lost her strength and hope. She has lost her desire for life, and she's lost her child. I can't bear to see him die. Everything is lost. Weeping and moaning, mother and son only await death. Sound familiar? Do you know that desert? Is it the same desert where you have walked aimlessly without reaching a safe destination? There's no way back or destination forward. You've been kicked out from your safe place. You've been abandoned to your fate. You feel enslaved. Water and breath have run out. You no longer have the strength to continue, and you think that this is the end. That it's better to give up and die than to keep trying. And do you feel that everything is already lost? Let me remind you that the desert is where God meets us. So the angel comes to Hagar. What do you have, Hagar? What's happening? The comforting voice of the angel of God is heard. He again calls her by her name, Hagar. Only this time, he no longer calls her Sarai's slave. It's Hagar. Plain and simple Hagar. Slavery is over. Do not worry. Do not fear. God has heard the cry of your son. God has heard you. You are no longer alone. God is here. God is with you. Do you feel like you have no longer strength? I will give you strength. The angel tells her, get up and pick up your son and hold him with your hand, with the strength that I give you. Remember, I am going to bless your son. She doesn't know how, but Hagar manages to get up. Her strength returns little by little, and with steps that are still unsure, she's trembling. She gathers with her son, who is still moaning under his breath. She takes him in her hands, in her arms, like when he was a baby, and lifts him up and helps him to stay on his feet. The angel of Yahweh is still with them. You no longer have water? Do you need to quench your thirst? Some water? Lift up your eyes and I will show you the provision for you. There is water here for you and your son. God has heard you. Without a doubt, this is one of the best Bible stories. A slave with no name or identity to her masters is used by them. She is abused and mistreated by them to fulfill their desire to have children. She makes the mistake of belittling her mistress and pays dearly for it, with mistreatment and contempt. And she flees into the desert where she meets God, who gives her a covenant and a promise for her son. Hagar returns to her masters, and again she's expelled with her son so that the child cannot have part of the inheritance. With barely a piece of bread and water, she wanders through the desert aimlessly until she loses all hope, even the hope of living. But God listened. He strengthened her and gave her a vision of the resources he had for her. There in the desert, she found freedom. Now the story ends with her son growing up and living in the desert. Ishmael conquered that place where he almost met his death because God was with him. And one more detail. Hagar, her mother, found him a wife in Egypt, which means that Hagar was able to return home. God hath heard her. God has heard you. Amen.